Footsteps climbed the stairwell at 2:14 a.m. Harlem. 7 men stacked in silence. $10,000 promised for one name. Bumpy Johnson lays a burned note on the table. He says, "Send one back, breathing." The building sat quiet, but it wasn't asleep. A radiator ticked like a cheap clock. Somebody's radio breathed low through a wall, then went quieter, as if the music itself heard something coming. Boot soles started climbing the stairwell. Slow. Measured. Not rushing, because rushing makes noise. 7 sets of footsteps rose in a line, tight enough to share the same air. The kind of men who didn't knock. The kind of men who believed numbers meant safety. On the bottom floor, a door clicked shut. Somewhere above, a floorboard complained. A woman's voice died mid-word. Harlem didn't need sirens to notice danger. It only needed a pattern to break. Behind one apartment door, Bumpy Johnson was already awake. No lights, no pacing, no frantic searching through drawers. He sat where the room gave him angles, chair turned slightly away from the window, table close enough to reach without leaning. The air inside the apartment was still, like it had been waiting longer than the night. On the table sat a glass with a shallow pour, untouched. Beside it lay a folded white note. Thin paper. Ink on the inside. A burn mark on one corner that refused to disappear. The stairwell grew closer. 4 floors, 3, 2. Then the boot stopped outside his level, and the hallway became a funnel. One way up. One way down. No room to spread out. No space to rush him together. A fist rose in the darkness and hovered near the wood, then lowered again. No knock. Knocking was respect, and respect wasn't why they came. A hand tested the doorknob. Locked. Another man leaned in, listening for movement inside. He heard nothing, and the silence didn't calm him. It tightened him. A tool appeared. Metal met metal in a whisper. A quiet pry meant to open a life without waking the neighbors. Inside, Bumpy reached down and picked up the folded note. He opened it once, just enough to see the writing again. Names, a time, a place. The kind of information men killed for. The kind of information that meant this wasn't random. He folded it back and set it down exactly where it had been. In the hallway, the lock gave up. The door shifted inward a fraction, then stopped, chain still holding, trembling under pressure. The men outside paused, recalculating in silence. Bumpy stepped close to the door and spoke through it. Calm enough to shrink the hallway. "One of you goes back." The building didn't answer. It listened. Harlem carried news the way it carried weather. Quietly and ahead of schedule. A car parked too long on a corner. A stranger standing still under a street lamp. A pair of eyes that didn't belong to the block. The neighborhood noticed those things first, because the neighborhood had to. Bumpy Johnson moved through that world without announcement. Not because people flinched when he passed, but because people adjusted. A shopkeeper kept the door open a little longer. A barber's hand steadied when a razor got close. Men on stoops paused their talk and let him walk through the space like it was already his. He didn't rule Harlem by tearing it apart. He ruled it by holding it together. A landlord tried to throw a family into the cold, and the eviction papers stopped existing. A local business got squeezed by outsiders, and the squeezing ended before it became a habit. A kid got jumped for crossing the wrong corner, and the corner learned the rules again by nightfall. It wasn't charity, it was structure. Harlem didn't survive on hope alone. It survived on somebody making sure the weak didn't get eaten in public. Outside, men never understood that. They looked at Harlem and saw crowded apartments and tired storefronts and faces that had learned to keep walking. They assumed it meant the neighborhood was loose. They assumed it meant nobody would protect it. They assumed it meant the city's power could be applied here without consequence. The city didn't protect Harlem the way it protected other places. That part wasn't a theory. It was routine. Patrol cars drove through like tourists. Detectives asked questions after the damage was done, then forgot the answers. Politicians showed up in daylight, smiled for cameras, and vanished when the sun went down. In Harlem, the system didn't fail loudly. It failed quietly, with paperwork and indifference. That was why men like the Seven Climbers could exist at all. They didn't come wearing gang colors or carrying street reputations. They came wearing older confidence, the kind that didn't need permission, the kind that believed a black neighborhood at night was a place where rules could be bent, then forgiven. They weren't looking for money first. They were looking for proof that they could do it. Bumpy understood that kind of threat. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't business. It was a message, dressed as violence. And messages like that only worked if fear spread wider than the act itself. So Harlem didn't wait for official help. It never did. The street kept its own eyes. Store owners, night cab drivers, men who swept sidewalks in the morning and stayed outside late enough to see who moved wrong. Women on stoops who remembered every face that passed them. People who didn't carry badges, but carried memory. That's how Bumpy learned what was coming before the boots ever hit his floor. Not through paranoia, through community. The building those 7 men climbed wasn't special to them, just another target on a list. But to Bumpy, it was a map. Tight angles, thin walls, a single-file stairwell that turned numbers into a problem. 7 could come up, but only 1 could leave with a story worth hearing. The 7 men didn't find Bumpy's address by luck. Hate had muscle, but it still needed directions. Somebody had to confirm the floor. Somebody had to say the name out loud and not choke on it. That somebody was local, not a stranger, not an outsider. A man who lived close enough to Harlem to benefit from it, and far enough from Harlem to pretend it wasn't his responsibility. The kind of man who smiled at neighbors, then sold information when the rent got heavy. His problem wasn't pride, it was paper. An overdue notice folded into quarters in his pocket. A landlord who stopped accepting excuses. A child's medicine that cost more each week. A boss downtown who'd started using the word replaceable like it was a joke. Debt didn't bruise a man's face. It bruised his options. He tried to move normal anyway. He walked the block like his feet weren't dragging. He nodded at people he knew. He kept his hands visible, like that alone proved he wasn't carrying trouble. Then the car found him. Dark paint, clean lines, parked too still. A man inside spoke with quiet certainty, the tone of someone who believed the city would forgive whatever happened next. He didn't say, KKK. He didn't have to. That kind of hate didn't need to introduce itself. It made promises the way old institutions made promises. They offered cash in a plain envelope, not a fortune, just enough to solve a short problem and create a long one. All that's needed is confirmation, the man said. Floor, door, tonight. The local man shook his head at first, not strong enough to refuse, but strong enough to pretend. He tried to stall, tried to make it tomorrow. Tried to make it somebody else. The voice in the car stayed calm. They mentioned his child's medicine, like it was public information. They mentioned how fires started in old buildings, how accidents happened to men who kept saying no. They didn't threaten loud. Loud threats could be repeated. They threatened like paperwork, quiet, precise, and hard to argue with. The local man took the envelope, not proudly, quickly, like it might burn his hands. That night he walked 2 blocks out of his way before circling back, trying to convince himself he still owned his own legs. He stopped near the entryway and pretended to tie his shoe, staying just long enough to stare up at the windows, counting floors, searching for a light, confirming what he'd already sold. The move was too careful. Harlem noticed careful. Across the street, a boy slowed his walk. A barber held still in his doorway. A cab driver waiting for a fare turned his head just enough to catch the man's profile. Nobody confronted him. Nobody shouted. The neighborhood simply recorded the moment and sent it where it belonged. Within minutes, the detail reached Bumpy, not as a dramatic warning, as a name, as a place, as a quiet certainty that someone had opened the door for outside evil to walk in. Bumpy didn't send men to drag the local man into a basement. He didn't beat a confession out of him. That would have been easy. That would have been loud. Instead, Bumpy took something more useful than revenge. He took position. A folded white note came into his hands before midnight. Names in ink, a time, a place, and a burn mark on the corner, like somebody tried to erase it after writing it down. The paper still held smoke in its fibers, the kind that didn't come from cooking. Bumpy kept the note close. He let the local man keep breathing. He let the pressure keep tightening around him. Because a man trapped by debt would do what trapped men always did. He would lead the wolves right to the door. The stairwell fed them upward like a throat. 7 men in a line, boots careful on the steps, hands close to pockets, and hidden metal. The building wasn't grand enough to intimidate anyone by itself. Just Harlem housing, tight angles, thin walls, a smell of old cooking and damp plaster. But narrow space did something to men who believed numbers made them safe. It forced them into order. It turned a crowd into a column. Bumpy Johnson didn't wait behind the door like a man begging for luck. He placed the apartment the way a chess player placed pieces. A chair angled so the window stayed out of his back. A table set where footsteps could be heard before silhouettes appeared. A lamp unscrewed just enough to keep the entry dim, not darkness, dimness. Darkness made men cautious. Dimness made men confident. On the table, the folded white note stayed visible. Thin paper, ink inside, burned corner like a scar. It wasn't a decoration. It was a quiet signal that tonight had been written down before it arrived. The boots stopped outside his floor, and the hallway became a funnel. One way up, one way down. No space to spread out. No room to rush him together. A fist rose near the wood and lowered again. No knock. Knocking was respect, and respect wasn't why they came. A hand tested the doorknob. Locked. Someone leaned in and listened for movement. He heard nothing, and the silence didn't calm him. It tightened him. A tool appeared. Metal met metal in a whisper. The lock gave up, and the door shifted inward a fraction, then stopped. The chain still held, trembling under pressure. Bumpy stepped close and spoke through the wood, calm enough to make the hallway feel smaller. One of you goes back. No answer. Just a shuffle of shoes, a breath drawn through cloth. The leader leaned close, voice low. Open it. Bumpy didn't argue. He stepped away from the chain and let time do what it always did. Men like this hated waiting. Waiting made them imagine things. So they pushed again. Harder. The chain strained. The screws complained. Cheap wood flexed like it didn't want to choose a side. Then the chain snapped. The door swung open into dim light, and the first man entered fast, expecting panic, expecting a target standing dumb in the open. Instead, the apartment gave him space and silence, and Bumpy wasn't visible from the threshold. Not immediately. The room swallowed the entryway. The first man stepped deeper because uncertainty hurt worse than danger. The second man followed, shoulder brushing the frame. The third behind him. Then the fourth. 4 bodies inside before any of them understood what the room was doing to them. The 5th man hesitated at the door, reading the tightness. The 6th and 7th stayed in the hall, half in and half out, trapped behind the bottleneck of their own plan. Now their 7 weren't 7 in any useful way. They were 4 inside, 3 stuck behind them, all of them bound by narrow geometry. Bumpy's voice came from the right side of the room, close and quiet. "Leave your hands where they are." The first man spun toward the sound and raised his gun. A lamp clicked on, not bright, just enough. Bumpy stood near the far wall where his face was visible and his body stayed half shadow. Clean suit, collar sharp, hands low. Calm. The first man fired anyway. The shot cracked loud inside the apartment, louder than it would have been outside. The bullet punched into plaster, throwing dust into the lamplight. A picture frame exploded on the far wall. The sound was meant to take control of the room. Instead, it only proved how little control they had. In tight spaces, gunshots didn't create fear in the right direction. They created confusion. Bumpy moved 1 step, not rushing, not ducking. 1 step that changed the angle. The second man tried to aim over the first man's shoulder and couldn't. The third shoved forward for a line of sight and collided with bodies. Metal bumped metal. Their own numbers turned into a problem. In the hall, the 5th man tried to push in, but the doorway fought him. The 6th bumped into the 7th. Someone cursed under breath. The stairwell behind them offered no comfort. It offered only retreat, and retreat wasn't what they came for. Bumpy lifted his hand slightly. A door near the back corner opened, the kind of door most people would mistake for a closet in the dim. A Harlem man stepped out with a shotgun held low, not pointed yet. No words. No warning. Just presence. The sight rewrote the room. 2 controlled angles, 1 blocked exit, 1 narrow hall, no space to spread, no clear target. The first man stepped backward without looking. His heel caught the chair near the kitchen entrance, and he stumbled. His gun dipped for 1 second. 1 second was enough. Bumpy's pistol came up like it had already been waiting there. 1 shot. Clean. Not sprayed. Not wasted. The first man dropped hard and didn't rise. The room held its breath again, but now the silence belonged to Bumpy. The second man lifted his gun and couldn't fire without hitting his own. The third man had nowhere to aim without shooting through bodies. The fourth backed into the wall, trapped between plaster and the truth that numbers didn't matter in a room that refused to hold them. Bumpy didn't chase them. He didn't turn it into a slaughter. He spoke, even quieter now. "One goes back." The words weren't a request. They were instruction. The same way a judge gave terms. The shotgun in the corner remained lowered, but it didn't need to rise. The exit was already controlled. In the stairwell, panic finally touched the men who hadn't entered. The 5th tried to pull back, but bodies blocked bodies. The 6th slipped on the step. Someone hit the wall hard. A thud traveled down the stairwell like an announcement. Boots scrambled downward, faster than they climbed, but not fast enough to become escape. Bumpy stepped toward the table and picked up the folded note with 2 fingers. He held it up so the burned corner showed in the lamplight. The paper looked small for what it represented. Hate written down, a plan recorded, a name circled for erasure. "You brought the wrong kind of paper," Bumpy said. Then he folded it once, folded it again, and slid it into his jacket like the night had been filed away. He looked at the man closest to the doorway, wide-eyed, breathing too hard. A man who hadn't fired, a man who still wanted to believe he could leave. Bumpy's voice dropped to something private. "You're the one." The man stiffened. Bumpy gestured toward the hall, toward the stairs, toward whatever life waited outside. "Walk out," he said, "and talk." The surviving men backed away, slow, careful, dragging their fear with them so it didn't spill into one last mistake. Boots disappeared into the stairwell. Shadows fell downward. The hallway emptied. Bumpy stayed where he was, calm in the dim, listening until the last footsteps were gone. Only then did the radiator become the loudest thing in the building again. The stairwell swallowed the sound of retreat the same way it swallowed the sound of arrival. Boots hit steps faster now, not measured, not confident, just trying to get down before the building decided to keep them. The hallway outside Bumpy's door stayed empty for a long beat after the last shadow disappeared. Silence like that wasn't peace. It was aftermath. It was the building holding still to see if anything else was coming. Inside, Bumpy didn't chase. He didn't lean out into the hall. He didn't send a man to finish what was already finished. He closed the door. Not slammed. Not dramatic. Closed. The chain went back into place like it belonged there. A chair leg scraped softly as he moved it back from the kitchen entrance. The lamp stayed low, dim enough to keep the room calm, bright enough to see what mattered. In the corner, the Harlem man with the shotgun remained still. Weapon lowered, eyes forward. No celebration. No breathless victory. The night stayed controlled. Bumpy crossed the room and looked at the wall where the first shot had hit. Plaster dust clung to the floor. Glass from the broken frame lay scattered like ice. That damage could be repaired. Wood could be replaced. Plaster could be patched. A message couldn't. He returned to the table and lifted the glass for the first time. One sip. Then he set it down again, exactly where it had been. A small act, but it told the truth. The room hadn't taken anything from him. The room had only confirmed what he already arranged. Outside, the stairwell carried a final set of footsteps. Only one pair now. The chosen messenger. The one who was meant to leave with lungs still working. That man didn't stop running until he hit the street. He didn't look back until the building was behind him. And even then, he didn't slow. His hand stayed open, visible, like he feared the night itself might accuse him. A car waited on the corner with its engine idling. The men inside weren't laughing. They were listening for sirens that never came. They were staring at the building like it had just exhaled something they didn't understand. The survivor leaned through the window and spoke without story, without flourish. Bumpy knew. 2 words that made the car's interior shrink. They asked him how many. They asked him what happened. They wanted blood and noise and chaos, something they could recognize, something that sounded like a fight they could retry. The survivor shook his head once. It wasn't a fight, he said. It was a room. Then he lifted his sleeve. A short burn mark sat on his forearm, fresh and precise, like a stamp applied without ceremony. Not enough to cripple him, enough to prove he had been close, enough to make lying impossible later. The men in the car stared at the mark. No one touched it. No one asked if it hurt. Pain wasn't the point. Proof was. The car rolled away before anyone could find better words. The survivor sat back and kept his eyes forward, like the city might change its mind if he looked behind him. Back inside the apartment, Bumpy adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and sat down again. The Harlem man with the shotgun slipped back into shadow and disappeared from sight, like he'd never existed. And in Bumpy's jacket, the folded note stayed tight and warm, waiting to be remembered. By morning, the story had already changed hands. It moved through Harlem the way smoke moved through winter air. Quiet, unavoidable, impossible to hold back. Nobody needed a headline. Nobody needed a police report. The street carried its own record, and the people who mattered heard it first. 7 went up. 1 came down. The details stayed thin on purpose. Thin details lasted longer. Too much explanation gave a story places to break. But a clean fact had no weak points. That fact made doors close earlier the next night. It made men on corners stand straighter. It made the wrong kind of strangers keep walking instead of lingering. Officially, nothing happened. That was the city's favorite language. No sirens flooded the block. No detectives knocked on doors. No newspapers printed a name with outrage. Harlem learned not to depend on official memory. Because official memory only worked when it benefited the people writing it. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He didn't perform. He let restraint speak for him. In his jacket, the folded note stayed where it belonged. Thin paper with a burn mark. Ink that refused to disappear. Not a trophy. A reminder that hate had paperwork too, and paperwork could be turned back on the hands that wrote it. The survivor's warning reached the kind of men who thought fear was permanent. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like certainty. Bumpy knew. If this world matters, stay close to it. Subscribe and keep the door open for the next chapter they never wrote down. And say it plainly in the comments. Was letting one man live the smartest move or the most dangerous one? More is coming. The parts history avoided.